Hello, everyone. This is the Bearded Music Teacher Podcast. I am Mr. E. You can find me on Twitter at MR underscore E underscore music FCS. Now, the Bearded Music Teacher Podcast, for all my new listeners and a reminder for my old returning listeners, is that this podcast is devoted to educational purpose, where this podcast, both video and audio, are available to my students as a way for them to receive a short and concise, um, encapsulating little thing that they can use to refresh their memory on what was being discussed in class. Or if they missed class, they can get at least something, um, so that way they can stay up to date on everything that is rock history. One final thing before we get rolling: any reproductions of this podcast or clips of this podcast, both audio or video, need to have expressed written consent by Mr. E. You can find me at Twitter, MR underscore E underscore music FCS. All reproductions are prohibited unless I express consent to do so. So, like I said, the folk music, as you can see on the video, and as I said in the last podcast, folk music was the next thing for the teenagers of the first wave of rock. So folk became the most popular style of alternative music among these former rock and rollers, and we have Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie as soloists, and then together as the Almanac Singers. You have things like "Goodnight Irene," which was a hit in the 1950s, or in the year 1950. "So Long, It's Been Good to Know Ya," which was in 1951, and "On Top of Old Smoky," which hit in 1951. Now, "On Top of Old Smoky," I still remember singing and teaching even the melody either in piano classes, like when I taught piano, when I took piano lessons as a student. I even remember singing it in classes as a child. But there is a little bit of a rub here. The folk artists ran into a bit of a problem because during the early 1950s, they were seen as possibly identifying as communists. And during the early 1950s, we had what was called the Red Scare. And so the U.S. government vigorously attempted to identify communists within the borders. And the Weavers, for example, were a group. They were cut short when they were blacklisted for reportedly being in sympathy with the Communist Party. So it was a little edgy, shall we say, a little edgy. But by the early 1960s, some folk artists, after being kind of concealed for a little while, kind of, okay, let's not be so outwardly political, they they once again became very openly political, as many aligned themselves with the civil rights movement and later the opposition to the Vietnam War. So, early 1950s, some of these folk artists were identified as communists, whether it be falsely identified or truly identified as communists. But later in the 1960s, they took on more of I guess you could say social justice, in the way of looking at the civil rights movement and the opposition to the Vietnam War, which I could tell you about those in, especially the Vietnam War, in large context, but that's not the topic for this particular podcast. Now, the folk lyrics frequently told stories of different societal problems, and the meaning of the lyrics was much more important to a folk listener than the actual prowess or talent of the singer or the group or even the looks. What mainly became important to folk audiences was the meaning of the lyrics, the stories that they told, and things of that nature. A big part of the folk culture's appeal was that it was an attempt to break with norms of the middle class life. And it was a way to kind of, again, rebel, I guess you could say. Um, against the societal norms. One index of popularity of folk is the steep increase of the number of acoustic guitars that were sold in the United States, as collegiate folkins, as we called them, folkins, were popping up throughout the country. And this really brought um, a great kind of grassroots, so to speak, um, uh, movement where we had these people that were growing up and buying guitars so that way they could play three chords or four chords or two chords and do a song like On Top of Old Smoky. And that was the hip, cool thing to do. And if you look at the increase in the number of acoustic guitars sold, I thought I saw one report of like upwards of, over half, over 50% growth of the amount of acoustic guitars sold. I'm not sure exactly the figure, um, but there was a abundance of acoustic guitars that were being sold during this time of the folk music in the early 60s. So there was also a brief fixation or fascination with the calypso style of music, and one famous one that I think of right away is a song by Harry Belafonte called "Banana Boat," and that placed number 5 in the pop charts, 7 in the R&B charts, and it was released in 1957. So it grew to more popularity right around that time, and it was again done in the movie Beetlejuice, the original Beetlejuice, um, where I believe Winona Ryder is one of the female leads in it, and they are possessed. There's the parents of the house where Beetlejuice stays in. Um, Invite people over, and Beetlejuice plays a little joke on them and possesses them, and they sing this song. It's a great little scene. It's fun. But with anything, I would ask that if my students are listening, please get parent permission to do that, to watch it. I'm not sure the rating. I don't want to cross any lines here, but that is a one that I look at and I go, huh? But yeah, it was very popular back then. Besides Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie, there's one that comes to mind real quick, another group that comes to mind, and that was the Kingston Trio. And their version of Tom Dula, which they called Tom Dooley, became their big hit. And so these guys were a group of three, and they would play anything from banjo to guitar to mandolin to ukulele to different types of guitars. They were very well trained in the way of their their prowess, I guess you could say, with folk and guitar playing. The Kingston Trio's pop sensitive approach to folk music proved to be the winner. They placed 10 singles in the top 40, which is a pretty good feat in and of itself. And that was between 1958 and 1965, which all were recorded for Los Angeles based Capitol Records, including Where Have All the Flowers Gone and Reverend Mr. Black. Accordingly, the Kingston Trio had a series of 19 top 40 albums in 1964. The group's first album, Kingston Trio, 1958, it was the year it was released, stayed in the pop charts for 195 weeks. That is insane. 195 weeks. If I remember, there's 50 some weeks in a year. 52, I believe. I could be wrong. That's a lot. That's 3 years. If I'm indeed right, picking the numbers off the top of my head, that is something like upwards of 2 to 3 years staying on the pop charts. And at that time, that was just that's a remarkable feat. That's really truly a case of, hey, yeah, they definitely did that. Now, the Kingston Trio and other groups that followed in their wake, such as the Highwaymen, the New Christie Minstrels, I think the Rooftop Singers were also in there. They also were much more pop oriented. Now, I would recommend, and this is what I do in class, is that I play for them. And luckily, if I remember sometimes, what I do is I bring in my album. I have an album where Tom Dooley was premiered by the Kingston Trio. Now, I say premiered in a very loose sense. That was when it was released under Kingston Trio's name. Um, so I play that record for them with specifically Tom Dooley in it, and we listen to it. We look at the instrumentation, the fact that there's clearly a banjo and the guitar, and it's the actual chords itself. If you look at Tom Dooley, it's very very simple, but the message behind it, it's actually a very dark tale. I only take excerpts from it because it talks about a condemned man that is sentenced to die because he killed people. And so I use that one a little bit, and then I use Where Have All the Flowers Gone? Where Have All the Flowers Gone, again, is a simple, the chords just keep going over and over and over and over. There's no real variation with Where Have All the Flowers Gone from verse to verse to verse to verse, or verse, chorus, verse, chorus, verse, chorus, and so on. But it tells the story of these young men, and they go off to some war, to some battle. They go far away and they come back, but they don't come back as what you would think as being human, as being living human men. They come back as dead soldiers. Um, and the women that they sing about are in love with these men. They kiss them goodbye. They come back though in coffins, and they're buried, and the women have to bury them. And so it's a very dark thing, but it's more pop oriented. And a lot of these things were very serious in nature. So if we want to look at the Kingston Trio in the way of two songs, I would say three, but my top three from the highest one that would be like, yes, you gotta check this out, would be Tom Dooley, then Where Have All the Flowers Gone, and then Reverend Mr. Black is okay, I feel. Although it did much better in the pop charts than Where Have All the Flowers Gone. They did do, Kingston Trio did do a bunch of different cover songs of traditional folk songs. That would, if you can find them, that'd be great. And if you want to change it up and add something that isn't Kingston Trio, check Michael Row the Boat Ashore, done by the Highwaymen. That actually hit number one on the pop charts in '61. And Walk Right In by the Rooftop Singers. That was number one in the pops, three in the R&B, and I think number 23, 24 maybe in the country charts in 1963. So Tom Dooley, Where Have All the Flowers Gone, both by the Kingston Trio. Then I would say Michael Row the Boat Ashore, then Walk Right In. Now, after we go through the Kingston Trio, the next podcast will be centered around Peter, Paul, and Mary. Peter, Paul, and Mary are actually a little close to my heart, as I remember Peter, Paul, and Mary with the DVD, or I shouldn't say DVDs, VHS. Go back a little further. The VHSs of their concerts, seeing them on TV and things like that in their older days of Peter, Paul, and Mary, doing a lot of educational things, and specifically a song that we're going to touch on called Puff the Magic Dragon. Well, that wraps up this podcast for today. Please make sure you check out the other podcast. I think this is episode 17. It's amazing that we've gone this far already. And you can find me on Twitter at MR_E_musicFCS. And thank you for listening to this and rocking and rolling with me through rock history. I'll see you next time.